be joined by Whitney and Rob Fisher from sunny Napa Valley. Thanks, guys, for being here. Thanks for sharing your afternoon with us.
Happy Friday, everyone.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. This is going to be a really fun seminar, I think, because there's so many things to talk about. I mean, I always enjoy going to taste your wines, and there's just so many layers of nuance. So we'll get to that in a bit. But I just want to let everyone know who's watching this. We want to make these as interactive as possible. So please give us your questions. And the sooner you give them to us, the sooner we can weave them into the conversation. And sometimes we get the questions all at the end, and then it's kind of like hard to answer them all. But if we get the questions now, there's a shot that we can plan them and try to get to as many as possible. So please give us your questions. But before we really dive in, guys, I'm just curious to sort of, I mean, I'm here in New York in this house, isolated from the world. Everybody's isolated. What is going on in Napa Valley, first and foremost? What's the mood like? How's your family? And I hope everybody's safe. So there's a bunch of questions, but give us the update.
I guess I'll start and say, I mean, each of us have kids, and so we're all being driven a little crazy at home, which is a great respite to get to the winery and have an excuse to be here and share a glass of wine at 2 o'clock. But it's a little reminiscent of some of the challenges we've had with the fires the last couple of years. I think people are social distancing is tough. We're a tight community. We like we like seeing guests and fans of wines out here and being together. And so that part is challenging. Obviously, the disruption to the wine market, especially restaurants, is concerning and weighing on all of us. But having the chance to get together like this and keep the wine community together is really important. Maybe you can talk about the season. I mean, it's so nice that we're in the middle of a spring. And
I think what gives us all some level of comfort and normalcy is that we are lucky enough to continue our work. So I think for all of us, I mean, Adam Goodrich, our winemaker's up at the winery right now watching this. We find solace in being able to do the work that we are so passionate about. The vineyard work obviously is still keeping up pace. We have lots going on right now. We're out suckering all the vines, and as you know, nothing stops for the plants out there. So it's a way to mark time, and for sure we all feel some level of normalcy when we can be engaged in the work that we do. And so we're lucky in that. Some people aren't as lucky, and we understand being at home is challenging for us all. So hopefully tonight, this evening, afternoon for us, but as we all have some wine and talk a little bit, we can bring some peace and togetherness.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, that's sort of why we've created this setting, is so that, it's Friday, but it feels like it could be any day, right? And we've lost our sense of structure, and not all of it, but some of it. And so that was the whole idea behind Vinous Live, is to sort of find a time that we can all sort of come together and talk, maybe for an hour, forget the news and the stuff that's surrounded by, or if you've got your kids at home, that's a lot of stress for parents for sure. So anyway, so many things we could talk about, but, I'm just really curious to learn a little bit more about your family's history, because your parents moved out to Napa Valley in the 70s, where, I mean, today the idea of sort of buying a vineyard or owning land, I mean, there's a certain romanticism about that. Everybody knows that it's much more difficult than that. But your Sonoma estate, Spring Mountain, is in a pretty remote area. So how do two people decide in the 70s that that's what they want to do? Because, there were 30 wineries in Napa Valley in the mid 70s. It was not what it is today. So how did that all happen?
So I think we like to start the story, just the old history is our parents were both working in San Francisco at the time. They had service industry jobs, and they met on a blind date, just to make the story a little more romantic. They got matched up as mixed doubles tennis partners, and they shared a common passion for food and wine, but they also were a little burned out of working long weeks and not having a tangible product. They had a couple of friends who were up in the Napa Valley and in Sonoma already at the time. That's a great photo of them, probably about 1975. But in 73, they quit their jobs and started looking for some raw dirt that they could plant. So that's mom and dad, Fred and Joelle. And my father had fallen in love with wine when he was in the army in Europe in the 1950s. And his first impression was just being blown away by the mountain grown wines in the lake region of Italy. And he thought if he was ever going to do something like that, it had to be in the mountains. So they started looking for just raw dirt that they could plant. And in 73, it's just incredible to think about that instinct or that notion. And frankly, Dad is the one who's he's a very practical guy, very pragmatic. And I'd say Mom is maybe a little more the adventurer and the romantic. And together they struck out to do this.
She always laughs because when they started clearing for some of the fields, one of the wedding vineyard where they were married and where the original planting was put, went in, and to do that he had to clear this it was an old farmstead kind of property, and so that area was a big meadow, but it still needed to be cleared. And so when Dad was out there on the tractor, he would push these small piles together and burn the material. And she came from a long line of farmers, big farmers, wheat farmers. And she'd be like, "Oh, this is silly. We've got to push them all together and make some big fire." And of course, he was a little timid, coming from Detroit, not knowing too much about farming. But so, therein lies my mom's big thinking and my father's pragmatism.
Got it.
So, Antonio, we were talking earlier, originally they had really just intended to start planting grapes, and the struggle of putting vines in the mountains from 73 to 75 led them to get a little more practical and decide to buy some existing planted acreage in Calistoga in 1975. And so we have two parcels that combine about 60 acres in Calistoga. But the year they delivered those small harvests to the Napa Cooperative, they felt like they were parting with their babies, and something more needed to be done with this really special fruit that they'd labored over. And so the McCraes over at Stony Hill and a handful of other families that had gotten started a little earlier convinced our parents that they could make small lot wine. And
that drove Dad to actually volunteer to work the harvest under the tutelage of Phil Tagny over at Coupe-Son, the original Coupe-Son, which is just past our property here on the Silverado Trail. And so he worked a vintage with him. It was a very rainy vintage.
It was 75.
Yeah, okay. We'd have to check that one, but yeah. So he that was his original winemaking teacher.
Pretty good teacher.
Yeah.
I mean, that's about as good as it gets, actually.
It is. It's about as good as it gets, which is fun because, his daughter, obviously, Lisa, and now we're on both sides of the mountain, but it's a great place to be.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then what happened? So that's late 70s. And then so the first bottled vintage is?
First commercial vintage is 1979. In 1977 and 78, they went on to harvest small quantities of fruit and essentially, true to the name of garages, they put these in large rubber bins, large garbage cans, and made wine in 77 and 78. Their good friend Bill Turnbull and Reverdy Johnson actually were just getting underway with the Johnson Turnbull Winery, and Bill Turnbull agreed to help design a mountain winery with my parents during those 2 years. And I think for anyone that visits the mountain winery, the original winery, it's really special to see the timber that was used. It was all harvested on the property. In fact, the aerial image you're showing there, the top left corner that's netted in white nets at harvest time, was the site of the original trees that were timbered to build the winery. And
and all of the wood that was used to build the winery came from that city. So Bill Turnbull completed the winery in 1978, and the first vintage 79 that was made.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to show this picture so that people could get a sense, so our viewers could see what mountain viticulture is like, because on the valley floor, it's a totally different situation. I mean, it may not be exactly flat, but it's mostly flat. And this is a totally different deal. It's hillside, it's terraced, it's curving. Obviously, the level of ripeness is going to vary, I imagine, quite significantly throughout those terraces. And so that probably means you got to be really attentive to the picking dates. And even if you look down here, these little swales, I mean, that's got to present a lot of, it's probably pretty hard to sort of manage that, I would imagine, no?
No, it's the reason I think I had some friends after I went into winemaking that said, I can't believe, it's just the same every year. I mean, are you really going to remain stimulated, intellectually stimulated? And I thought, are you kidding me? I mean, every year we are trying to improve upon these decisions we make and the farming decisions we have. And because of the unique topography, yes, you're looking at minute picking decisions in lots of different small places. We have a number of different considerations throughout, and it's mind-boggling, and it keeps us all on our toes.
Well, and to add perspective to that image that you were showing, that was a top aerial image, and that's 300 feet from top to bottom. There's 25 feet between those terraces, and the rows that are planted in the fall line are on a 45-degree slope. That's as steep as you can actually drive an Italian Landini cat tractor, and you only drive it up. You don't drive it down. So,
and you got to be pretty brave.
Right. You do.
Well, I'm not capable of it, so I don't even enter the conversation here. Kidding. So why don't we start? So you have, I mean, one of the things that I think is unique about your family is you make wine. You've got estate vineyards in two very different places. The original, as you've described, your parents' first vineyard was in Spring Mountain, which we'll talk about in a second. And then you have vineyards in Calistoga. Spring Mountain, so for folks watching, I mean, you can get a sort of connect Napa Valley and Sonoma. And so we'd get to your place by, if you're in Napa, you would take Spring Mountain Road, you drive that up, you pass Kendall Jackson, you pass Keenan, and you pass Tony, and then you get up to the top where you have people like Barron's and Vineyard 7 and 8. And that's right around where the line is. Right. And then you go down and you're into the Sonoma side, and there's Pride, and then there's Cornell, and then on the left there's you guys.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's no cell service there.
No, we have to hook it up especially for everyone.
The reason I know that road really well is because I've driven it like 1,000 times back and forth. Like, where's this damn entrance? Yeah.
You're not the only one.
No. So, but this is an interesting part of California because we say it's Spring Mountain, but there is really no such thing as Spring Mountain. This is Mayacamas Mountains. Right. And you've got this rugged hillside vineyard there. And so tell us a little bit about what you make, what you make out of that site.
I was just going to start in the early years to mention, Antonio, the early plantings of the Cabernet in the mountains we struggled to get ripe enough to make wines on their own. And for the first 10 years of production, we included some of the Napa fruit with the Sonoma mountain fruit, the mountain estate fruit. And we're bottling Napa Sonoma wine. So as you mentioned, it's unusual that we have for almost now 50 years, 48 years, farmed vineyards on both sides. And it really, I mean, Whitney can get into a little more detail, but the early years of beginning to identify the uniqueness of each site, I think a lot of credit goes to Paul Hobbs, who joined us in 1990. And Whitney and I were just grade school, headed off to high school, and remember those years. And I think that was the evolution of our first vineyard designates that remain part of our core lineup today in the mountains, which had include Whitney's Vineyard, Wedding Vineyard, Mountain Estate Vineyard, Cabernet, and Chardonnay, and the Hidden Terrace Syrah.
Right. You know, it truly is one of the most unique sites. We're an island. We like to say we're a bit of an island out there, because many people ask, well, who's your direct neighbor? I said, well, we don't have one, because it's unique. We are completely on our own. As you drive into the property, you mount a pretty serious hill, as you're familiar with. It's very steep. And you come in, and we have our Whitney's Vineyard is the first vineyard you see as you enter our property, and it's on a gradual slope of about a 5% slope, and it is all kind of volcanically derived. It's ash, mainly ash, that's fallen on top of these old stone. It's very stony as well, and it faces the southwest. So ideal exposure, and that is the original planting was planted to the old Wente clone. The clonal material was sourced from Stony Hill, as Rob said, and the vineyard is a very special spot, not just because it's named for me, but it was planted before I was born, but it came into production the first year that I was living, and so it got my name. Again, I love Chardonnay, and so for me, it's one of these special places that the wines that it produces just really, it's got a stamp of unique minerality, but also quite a lemon kind of honeysuckle floral element to it as well. And I love it. So I'm drinking a little bit now.
So am I. I'm sure we'll see what bottles people have opened, our viewers have opened. But I mean, Chardonnay in the mountains is really distinctive. I mean, your neighbor, Vineyard 7 and 8, they have a really beautiful Chardonnay also. And there's something about that structure. I mean, it's obviously very Chardonnay, but there's a breadth and a body. In fact, one of the questions here from one of our viewers is what Grand Cru vineyard in Burgundy is most similar to your wine. So you're
I'm really putting me on the spot right now, you know.
That was a question for me, actually, but you can answer it too.
We'll let you answer that, Antonio. That's to you.
At least the question is not what Premier Cru vineyard is like yours. So that's pretty good.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I mean, I agree with you on the mountain, and it's specifically our mountain area, I think really lends itself to Chardonnay and to the structure. And a lot of what creates that structure is the elevation, it's the thickness of the skins, the small berries, all of those add a certain amount of phenolic to the wine. And so for me, what makes it so exciting is that these wines can almost have the imprint of a red wine. And so, you know, oftentimes people say, well, I don't really like Chardonnay. I say, well, you know, let's give it a try, please. You know, don't jump to conclusions. And then they're always surprised. I think what does make our Chardonnay unique is not only the way that we're making it in the cellar, but also clearly where it's grown. And the site is a huge driver.
Yeah. So if I had to answer the question about what Grand Cru site is closest to this style, I mean, see, it's a Chardonnay of weight. It has that sort of honeysuckle, candied lemon peel kind of unctuousness. And so in Burgundy, obviously that takes you to Chassagne Montrachet, or possibly Saint-Aubin doesn't have Grand Crus, but the question was about Grand Cru. So, I mean, obviously I think you're in Chassagne where you get the more richer, more viscous, more ample style of wine. Hopefully, yeah. So hopefully that's an answer. But one of the things you also do, which is pretty unique, is you give your wine longer aging in barrel over vintage, which is not so common in California these days. So where was that idea born from? Did you have a model or inspiration?
No, really not. It actually came from the fact that, as we all know now, you know, more and more people cannot cellar wines as long, and so for most people, they're wanting the enjoyment of a wine with less aging in the cellar. So we really noticed that our Chardonnays were so much better actually after a year or two in bottle. And so that was really the driver to continue to age slightly longer, leave them on lees a little bit longer. We get a little bit more of that roundness. The wines just seem at a point that's much more approachable when they get to our customers. So I think that's important. It was driven by that, but I think it also, it's improved some of the structure and weight of the wine as well. So I think the first decisions to do that, we were a little nervous, frankly, but we've really loved the result, and so we've continued to do this, and I think it's borne through as a really great technique for us, for our area.
Yeah, just so for the benefit of folks watching, the more traditional way to make Chardonnay in California is to bottle what is called under vintage, which means you bottle your Chardonnay in July, August before the following vintage, and that way you can reuse. You put the barrels into this annual cycle, and that's kind of the more common way. So your approach is much more Burgundian, which is to leave the wine in the barrel, what people would call 2 winters in technical terms.
Exactly, exactly, and for sure that their example has helped us to make this leap.
And what about Cabernet on that property?
So Cabernet, the oldest Cabernet vines that we have planted were in the Wedding Vineyard. It was planted to both AXR and St. George originally, and the cuttings were taken from the Martha's Vineyard. So Martha's Vineyard clone Cabernet was there originally, and that vineyard was replanted in 2001 by David Abreu and in consulting with David. And we kept the Martha's clone because we wanted to have really that original heritage clone there and retain the uniqueness. And then we also added the clone 337, which I think has done so well in that region for us. And we chose a couple different rootstocks. We also added a little bit of Petit Verdot, a small block of Petit Verdot, and a small block of Cabernet Franc, which have been outstanding. And in certain vintages, we've actually bottled 100% Cabernet Franc from the Wedding Vineyard as well. We are a cooler region, and because of that, I think the wines we make have a really classic stamp of Cabernet Sauvignon to them. So it's again, one of my favorite places to be is on the mountain.
Yeah, so I'm tasting this wine, which is your Mountain Estate 2017.
Yeah.
And I think the subject of climate is very important. I mean, I remember when I tasted these wines with you, it was last fall. We might have tasted them in the barrel the year before. I don't remember that, but I know we tasted them in the bottle in the fall, as we would every year. And then I tasted them again in my office, maybe a month or so later. And I'm tasting this wine again, I don't know, 6 months later. And, I think that this is a vintage that's gotten has a very modest reputation because there were severe heat spikes in Labor Day. And then obviously there were those fires, but your wine is so fresh. It's so vibrant. It's as it's always been. It has that slightly savory old school character, but there's a lot of fruit. So when you get really big heat spikes, what are the differences between how your vineyards in Sonoma react versus the valley floor in Calistoga, which is a hotter area?
Right. I think first of all, it's really interesting to know that we're moderated in heat by about 10 degrees on average from high temperatures in the valley to high temperatures on the mountain. During major heat events like we had in 2017, that difference is not as great, but it makes a world of difference. And we get a much more impactful cool down when the winds shift and we get the winds coming off the bay into the Mountain Estate. So I think that makes a big difference. It also makes a big difference that we are usually our veraison is delayed there. So that can also make a big difference in terms of some of the impactful inclement weather we've had that have so affected Napa Valley has not affected it as greatly in the mountains as a result. So I think those are two.
Interrupt you for everyone watching. Veraison is when the grapes turn red, right? And a late veraison would imply a late harvest, right? Because people sort of say that's kind of the beginning of the last phase.
They
right?
like to say that, yeah, that's the last phase. It also parallels with the softening of the skins. So the skins are quite hard and impervious, and then they become soft.
It isn't just duration though, right? It's the whole season is shifted about 2 to 3 weeks later. So it's quite a different season, mountain to valley. Bud break happens 2 to 3 weeks later in the mountains, and we end up harvesting into late October, November often.
Yeah.
I mean, that wine is showing great. It does have that sort of Martha's savoriness.
Yeah.
I'm curious, did you replant, when you replanted, did you replant from your own material, or did you get sort of the David Abreu Martha's stuff?
That's a great question. I love that question because it has differed in different plantings. In this particular instance, he was fairly insistent on getting his selection, which I think has been great. So he did procure a selection from his vineyards, and I have to say in different vineyards it's been different sources, but for the Marthas it did come from David.
Yeah. So I thought you weren't going to answer.
Oh,
I was going to say we might need to check the contract, but just for everybody else watching as well, we wanted to share a few wines that we've just released. And to your point about the interest in 2017, I think we love hearing the response from folks on our list that have already this spring just received this wine, and so we're hearing a really great feedback about 17.
Cool. Before we sort of wrap up the Cabernet on the mountain, just so for the benefit of everybody watching, the David Abreu Madrona clone, that's what's in Madrona Ranch and a lot of his most top vineyards. So
right.
Yeah, if that were available, I think most people would say, yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah, for sure. And now on the terraces that are above the wedding vineyard, the terrace Cabernet, actually, the clone of that Cabernet is taken from our Lamb vineyard, which is the original C clone. So a heritage clone that was taken from the Silverado vineyard that had been owned prior by Mr. C. Of C's Candy, and that came from there. So that's a little bit different. And those are the two clones, along with 337. So 3 clones of Cabernet that we have growing on the mountain estate.
Awesome. And then you also make Syrah, which is nice to see because it's not so common anymore.
Right.
But mountain Syrah, there's just not too many. I mean, obviously I can think of Colgan, but that's all the way at Pritchard Hill, all the way completely opposite end, and there's just not too many. I mean, I think Pride does have some, but there's not a lot. So
I don't know if Whitney's going to give you the straight story on this, so I'm just going to start by saying it's a fun story because when Whitney came back to the winery a few years before me, and we had some rootstock growing in volcanic ash at the highest elevation of the property. And up until that time, our father, Fred, was always the certified weighmaster of any harvested fruit that came in. And the season, so Whitney got to the winery, decided, this volcanic ash planting really should be grafted to some Syrah. And to this day, to hear our dad talk about his shock when he saw Syrah on the harvest, on the crush pad coming in, is really kind of enjoyable to think back. I like to say you went rogue, and it was just such a great decision.
Well, this place it's a unique site on the property because it's called the Hidden Terrace. You cannot see it. And I was putting my son to bed the other night. He goes, "Mom, I love going to the mountain, and there's the Hidden Terrace is just so peaceful up there." And I think he and his cousins think it's a really secret spot. And so he was saying that he can't wait to tell his newest cousin, who just turned 2, that she's going to make her first trip up there. And so it's at the very top of the property. It's hidden, and it's planted. It is again a southerly facing vineyard, and it's very, very steep. So we cannot farm it with a tractor at all. So it's all hand farmed and planted to clone 174. But I love, I really love the Rhone style Syrahs. The 16 is a fairly opulent version, but the white pepper, the bay laurel, the more savory elements to me of Syrah, and particularly our mountain Syrah, I think are very unique.
Well, and Antonio, you made the point about the uniqueness of a mountain-grown Syrah. The site itself is really two sides of a steep, small canyon where this volcanic ash had settled and compacted. And so it actually is sort of a cool exposure as well as being high elevation.
Yeah.
And what's your view on whole cluster for this wine?
So I mean, we have really loved whole cluster. It's something that we take on a vintage to vintage decision. So we don't do it always, but it is something that we have done with the Syrah and particularly liked. We love the structure that it adds. So you can add, it adds more of that tannin. And to me, in a vintage like 2016, it was a no-brainer to go that direction. And really with great results. So
cool.
Yeah.
So now let's talk Napa, because you have beautiful land in Calistoga, sort of like in the Pickett Lane area. So that's like right across the street is Isley Vineyard, and then Kelly Fleming further down, and Jason Woodbridge up in the hills, and Kennefic Ranch. So you're sort of in that district. And
Yep.
I think, Alessandro Masnaghetti and I are working on this map of Calistoga, which I promise you we're going to get done. But, one of the things that you notice when you go up either the trail or Highway 29, as I've written before, one has the perception of going from south to north, but you're really going from east to west. And in Calistoga is where that becomes very pronounced. So here we are on the valley floor in Calistoga. This is the northern end of, northwestern end of Napa Valley. You've got several vineyards there. So what's different besides the harvest time? I mean, what is it about the soils there that really make the soils or the microclimate that give birth to these wines that you make there?
Well, I think it's really important to note just on the soils side of things that above in this photo, you can see a little bit are the Rocky Palisades above in the Bacchus Range. And so where we are located is on both sides of Simmons Creek, which is an alluvial creek that flows out of that gap. And so for years and years, millions of years, we've had erosion of that volcanic material down through the creek bed. The creek bed is meandered through our property. And so we have these alluvial soils that tend to be much more cobblestone, volcanically derived on the eastern or technically northern. I like to, yeah, so the northern side where our lamb vineyard is the amount of large cobblestones is greater than as you come further to the south of the property. We get more of the finer silts towards where we now have our winery, where we're sitting here.
The confluence of Simmons Creek and the Napa River.
Yeah, so here's another view.
Yeah, that's a good view.
Yeah.
So that creek bed that's bisecting top to bottom is Simmons Creek.
Yeah, right here, right?
Right.
Exactly.
And then we also get this great, there's a pinch point in the valley, which you can see coming down along that area that you can see on the right-hand side of the photograph now. And that pinch point, you kind of, if you're on the Silverado Trail heading, what we would say now is east, you would be going up a small hill and then coming down into the canyon where Three Palms is. And I would say we are somewhat moderated from that other area in temperature. So we're actually not as warm as the other area where that point is bisected. And so I think for that, we get this great breeze coming from the south or from the west to the east. And that's a very strong influence on temperature moderation of our area. So I think that's important to know.
Yeah, it is for sure. You make several wines from the Calistoga vineyards, right? There's the Merlot, and then there's the two Cabernets, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Three Cabernets if you include Cameron, the red wine blend.
Which is kind of one of your mid-tier wines, right? Or one of your entry-level wines. It
is as a young vine blend mostly, but a little more fruit forward intentionally.
Yes, yeah. So our lamb vineyard Cabernet, I guess we could start with, because that's the vineyard that is what we have here. I'll ask you.
Oh, thanks.
Cheers. So the Lamb Vineyard Cabernet it's a unique vineyard that was planted and named after my grandfather. So my mother's father, Dr. Robert Lamb, he was a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, and loved wine and really wanted to get it like many today, wanted to get a piece of vineyard and support the winery, and bought this property and that was planted to Cabernet. The Cabernet that's grown there is such a unique flavor profile. It tends to have quite a bit of kind of almost cola berry backbone to it. It's got a velvety texture and some beautiful tannins. So to me, it's one of the most unique vineyards we have, and the resulting wine just speaks for itself. So 2016, I think, is what we've got here.
And one of the few bottlings that we make that's 100% Cabernet.
That's correct.
Every year.
Can I ask?
And then what about your Merlot? Because your Merlot does not taste like a typical Merlot. It's we're back to this profile that's very aromatic, very savory, a lot of layers of flavor. It's not your sort of juicy, sort of fruity kind of style. It's much more, actually, it's much more in line with your other wines, very sort of, I don't like to say old world leaning, but it's definitely more towards the aromatic, savory side as opposed to the super concentrated, opulent side. So is that a picking decision issue or decision factor? Is it clonal? Is it the micro?
I think we've always been pegged a little bit as an old world approach, but in this particular wine, it grows right alongside the creek. It's grown on riparian, and so this
riparian is a rootstock
that's right, a rootstock that is it's fairly diminutive, and in this area, I think that we have two different clones of Merlot, but I particularly the picking decisions we don't like to have that. I think once you reach ripeness that goes over the edge, you lose the individuality of the wine and the site. So we really do try to pick appropriately. We also are blending this wine with Cabernet Franc grown in the same vineyard. And so again, we have that 327 clone of Cabernet Franc. And there is some Malbec also in this wine that we grow in the same block. So it is a blend. It is meant to be more of a right bank style. And it is a little bit more brawny, I suppose, than the jammy style.
Well, so I think it'd be great to take some questions because we've got a ton of questions now, and I want to make sure that we get to as many of them as we can. And one of them from Barbara is in fact about blends. So what is the process for putting together a blend? And your blended wines would therefore be the RCF and the Cameron, whereas the other wines are pretty close to monovarietal, correct?
Correct. The Coach Insignia does have, we usually look at Cabernet Franc as a blender in that, as well as a small amount of Petit Verdot, depending on the vintage. But
so another
I think
Calistoga Cabernet wine.
That's correct. It's another Calistoga Cabernet wine. That's a great question with the blending. We have the RCF vineyard is in fact 8 different blocks, each block being its own variety. And so when we look at that and we break them down, we're fermenting many different small ferments, and we sample those all separately when we come to make the blend. And so in those sampling sessions, we're looking for a marriage of typically Merlot and Cabernet Franc that meet up and give the expression that we have, which is a little bit slightly more savory. But we want to maintain that softness and that elegance of a Merlot as well. So that's really the process.
Well, the other comment maybe you can talk about is a little bit of the fact that over the decades, we've come to know each of the sites better and plant them to more specific pieces that are suited for the soils and winemaking wise. And so for anybody that doesn't recognize where we're sitting, this is not the winery that was built in 1978. This is a new project here that we've always dreamt of having a place to make wine on our Napa property. And we're sitting in a new fermentation room, part of the winery that we built last year, specifically so that we can have these small lots of fermentation and keep them separate and begin looking at smaller blends like that.
And also, as the French would say, they would never allow you to vinify both in the same winery. So now we're really truly separated that way, and it's exciting. So for those of you who haven't seen it, and Antonio always asks his first question when he tastes is, "What's new?" Well, unfortunately, Antonio, I'd love to show you, but we'll have to wait a little longer for that.
No, we're gonna have to wait a little longer. All right. As I taste your 16 Lamb Vineyard Cabernet, that wine really feels to me like it's really closed down a lot. It's really very tight right now. So Brian asks, which of your wines do you think is the most age worthy? And more or less, do you find that there's a consistency in like where these wines plateau, or is it much more, let's say, driven by the vintage?
That's a great question. I think that it's very vintage driven. And I think that, for example, it's vintage driven, and I would say our mountain wines tend to be long lived. And a little bit of that is due to just maybe the thicker skins, the more it's I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I really liked listening to Kathy Corson talk about that ebb and flow and looking at wines 10 years after vintage. And I think I could really identify with what she was describing in terms of, I see our wines come and go through their expressive phases. And I think I can see the 2016s in a bit of a quiet phase after that early youthful expression in the first year or two in the bottle. But that said, the 16s are such beautiful wines that I think that 10-year check-in is absolutely going to be rewarding.
So if you're at home drinking a bottle or with friends, you like ideally you'd want to open like a 10-year-old vintage?
I love the 10-year mark. I love early, like the Mountain 17 we just tasted, but the 10-year mark is my go-to. I like there being a routine, a consistent variable in the analysis as well. So 10's easy, but I do think they come within 2 or 3 years of that mark, come into this beautiful place where you see some of the secondary character show with still some of that freshness of fruit very evident.
Yeah, it's funny because we've asked this question, we get this question almost in every seminar, and so therefore obviously like we've gotten like 5 answers to that question every week. And the consensus, which I think is pretty interesting, because you're asking the same question of people who are completely unrelated to each other in different parts of the world who make different kinds of wines, and there does seem to be this sort of convergence of views, which is you either drink a wine right when it's bottled, like within the first 2 or 3 years, and then like after 10. And the number of people who've said that is just really quite amazing. And so I just think it's really cool when you start to, if you ask a lot of really bright, capable, intelligent people who taste a lot of wine the same question, and you get the answers tend to converge. I think that's pretty good advice for folks watching this. I mean, I'm really now paying attention to that. So it's like, yeah, and within the first couple of years, and then maybe like 10-ish. So that's pretty neat.
Well, and it's been nice to see Vinous and Steve's writings on those vintage retrospectives. I think a number of them have coalesced around the 10-year mark, and we really appreciate you guys dedicating some time. You got plenty of wines to taste, never mind retasting 10 years later, but I think that's really useful.
Yeah, we do that for a lot of regions and a lot of reference point wines. I just think it's important. I mean, one, you want to see how if the way you viewed a wine when it was released has played out. But I think, people have a lot of these wines, and nobody, just because of the popularity of wines like this, nobody is sitting on cases and cases. People have 2, 3 bottles of this, 1 of that, 6 of that. And so I think it's valuable to say, hey, these are the wines that you might want to start drinking, and maybe these are the ones that you can put away, and these are the ones you want to give to your in-laws. I don't know. But I mean, the point is, that we
it's all in trouble.
Yeah, I know. But I'm just saying, that we try to, I think it's important to sort of follow the wine in its life as much as possible. So a couple of people have asked about 17. So I'm curious, sort of the question, for example, a number of people have asked, how did you reach the quality level that you did in 2017 given all the challenges that there were all over the place.
I have to let Whitney speak to the technical side, but I do want to tell just one story, because I think Whitney and I will never forget the morning we woke up Monday morning after the Tubbs Lane fire had done most of its damage. We had a call from a good contractor friend of ours asking if we needed a generator, and if we did, he'd be happy to bring it over to us. Well, it led to us wrestling with the issue of mandatory evacuations and getting access to the facilities. I mean, I think a lot of people talk about 17 and or ask and should know. In our case, we had harvested over 90% of our fruit before the fires hit, and the issue really was access. And so Whitney and I shared a ride up Spring Mountain looking to get access to the property. Our vineyard foreman had already come from the Calistoga side, and they had a dividing line. They said, you can walk from here, but we won't let any vehicles through. And I said, well, does a double axle generator qualify as a vehicle? And he said, no, that's fine, as long as you got something to haul it on the other side. And so we got our foreman to pick up the CHP, Highway Patrol, was about to run out of gas. And he said, while you're bringing a vehicle, and could you bring some gas as well? And we also happen to know there was a batch of chocolate chip cookies that Mom had cooked the night before and evacuated and left behind. So we had our foreman bring diesel or unleaded gas and chocolate chip cookies to hand off at the dividing line, which allowed us to get our generator through and power the facility and eventually have access daily to make the wines. And that was one of the real challenges.
I mean, it made a big difference to be able to have power up and running when you have fermentation sitting in. One of the things that I think our team was very good getting it, we pulled together, and I think during times like these, sometimes it brings us all together. We've got a great team, and again, every day was different. For us, we were permanent, we were evacuated, so getting access to the building we had to be creative on a daily basis, and that was difficult. Eventually, the Sonoma County Ag Department actually had escorts for us coming in daily, and we would come in for a 12-hour shift and then be escorted out. So that did, it made it somewhat doable, where you didn't feel like you were going to be breaking the law to try to get to work. I think some of the things that made our blending decisions and made the resulting wines what they are is really looking at what, taking a close look at what we were intentionally putting in bottle. There's not something that we wanted to put out there that didn't meet the scrutiny of our customers and who we sell wine to. These decisions were very, we made far less wine, very deliberate. So our blending sessions were exciting also, because we had the opportunity to say, well, if it's not making this better, we're going to leave that and put it aside. So I think for that reason, the resulting wines really show that kind of level of attention and detail.
Well, and as a result, the quantity of wine we bottled from the 17 is down 30 to 50% for many of our estate labels. Tiny quantities.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think that obviously the fires were devastating, but before that you had heat spikes, so you had to know when to pick in and around or after that. And then a lot of wines were lost because wineries lost power and people couldn't get in. I mean, you can get away with a couple of days like that, but places were inaccessible for much longer than that. And so the implications of all of the things that happened in 2017 are many. And I mean, so last year, 2019, there were planned power outages. Yep. That coincided with harvest. And folks watching this would be shocked how many high-end, well-known wineries did not have generators. And that power is going to go out because PG&E is telling you, look, we're going to shut off power. They're doing this because of the threat of high winds and nobody wants a repeat of 2017. So the utility company is saying, hey, we're going to shut off the power around these dates. And if you don't have power, you can't sort, so you can't really harvest. And still, this is still an issue, and it's probably going to be an issue. Probably all businesses and wineries will have to have independent power because these incidences are not going to diminish over time. If anything, they're going to increase, so it takes a lot of foresight to be ready like that.
I mean, I will say in the last 2 years, it's incredible how much progress has been made at clearing lines and adding redundancy on the grid, at least around Napa Valley. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a challenge to plan for, but we are seeing, I think, moves in the right direction that are going to make the duration of those outages hopefully grow shorter and then hopefully grow less frequent.
But that's absolutely true. And last year, for example, we had our intern living in Healdsburg evacuated middle of the day. He has to go home and get all of his things. He's just one of your team that's displaced, and you're having to stand in and make it work. And so I think with all of this, with all of these emergencies, we tend to come together and get a lot stronger. And I think the be prepared is absolutely right. We know that we need to be prepared, and that's one of the things we're good at is really focusing on what makes a difference for our winemaking and for our end product. And let's get that done because that's what we're here for. This is what we do. We can't work all year long and have it go for naught.
Had a lot of practice.
Yeah, we've had a lot of practice.
Looking forward to wines that aren't in bottle yet. Kathleen asks, what do you think are the standouts of 2018?
Many.
She's drinking a 2013 Cameron, by the way.
She's drinking 2013 Cameron. Okay. Well, Kathleen, that's a good question. I think some of the standouts, no doubt about it. With the 2018 Chardonnays are already in bottle. I've been drinking them. And
just released. The Mountain Chardonnay, yeah.
There we go. Phenomenal. Some of the standouts to me really are the Cabernets from our mountain. Both our mountain and our Lamb Vineyard Cabernets are tremendous in terms of just structure. The structure is pretty remarkable. I think it is something that's going to be pretty exciting. They've aged well, I think, and we're really excited to get those into bottle. So coming around to the next step in the fall, we'll get there.
Antonio, I can't help but also chime in. We love when we have the opportunity for people to visit the winery, come out to Napa and taste these wines. And now we're in this, all of us are in this conundrum of how can we share these wines with people that are out there. And I think everybody is coming up with new solutions, but for 17s, 18s, early looks of these wines, I know we're creating a program. If anybody's interested, message us, shoot us an email, but we're working to find and make available new avenues to get people opportunities to taste these wines just like they would when they're out here in the Valley. And to talk to us. And talk to us, yes.
I mean, look, everything is changing like every day. You don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I mean, you have to be adaptive. And I think that we're at a very unique point in time, but it is, I think, going to create a lot of new things will come out of this, including hopefully a lot of learning. On the subject of Chardonnay, Jeff and Therese ask, what are the main differences between the two Chardonnays, the Mountain Estate and the Whitneys? Is it more about soil, clone, exposure?
All of the above. So really a great question. Our Mountain Estate Chardonnay, which is really, if we could go to, maybe you could put up the overview of the mountain.
Overhead shot.
The overhead shot. Our Mountain Estate vineyard is northeast facing. It's gravelly, steep, planted vertically. It is Dijon clone selection. So it's clone 96, 95, and 76 from Dijon. So different plant material. It definitely drives a different flavor profile of the resulting Chardonnay. The Whitney's is all Old Wenty, and in that respect, when we've planted our own material when we have replanted. It's all been from our own vineyard sites. And so that there's a difference there. The soil type is different. So the Whitney's Vineyard, as you drive in, it is more ash and clay. The Mountain Estate is far more gravelly. And so exposure difference, also the height, altitude difference. The Mountain Estate Vineyard is close to 1,300 feet. And whereas the Whitney's Vineyard is at one of our lower points in the property, so around 900 feet elevation. All of those are.
So the follow-up, yeah. So the follow-up question is: Cameron has a wine, Whitney has a wine. Why doesn't Rob have a wine? But I think it's your wine, right?
Yeah, the RCF Vineyard. Yes, that's right. The RCF Vineyard is my wine. A little more covert, but that's middle name is Charles. And a lot of times people ask the question, how did each of us end up with our respective labels? And we got to sort of punt on that and ask mom and dad how that came out. But it feels like each of us have labels that are in some way reflective of our personalities. And I don't know which direction that goes, if it's if it's us to the wine or the wine to us, but it is what it is.
I think over time we find ourselves becoming a part of the land and the land becoming a part of us. So I think we as we say, that's what's happening.
No, I get it. And here's a great question. Favorite, do you have a vintage
You're laughing, I'm worried.
No, come on. Just having fun on a Friday afternoon. It's 5 here, so like I can drink, you know.
That's right.
You guys have to work.
But we're in Napa, so we can drink.
Yeah, it's like almost the end of the day.
School's out by the time we get home.
Okay. Is there a favorite vintage or wine, or how do you view that? I mean, I'm glad I didn't get asked that. So, Whitney first.
I assume that's of our own.
Yeah. You tend to gravitate towards one over the other, or one over the others, or?
Oh, that's so hard. I mean, that's like talking about your children, or no. There have been some pretty phenomenal. I love the 1995 wines. I think those wines are amazing. We just enjoyed a 1996 wedding vineyard for our annual Christmas gathering as a company. That was pretty epic right now. These wines are drinking really well now. I don't know, how much longer, but for now, those have been standouts to me.
Shameless plug, the 97 RCF Vineyard Merlot, if you can find it. It's incredible to see a Merlot Cabernet Franc from our region show like that wine is today. We've been really pleased opening that recently. Personally, I think my favorite might be 2017 Whitney's Vineyard that we're actually drinking. I have to say
we don't have any left.
The yields
so,
were so small. This is the only excuse we really had to open one bottle from the last 6-pack in existence here. I should also say maybe I love it because it's also my wife's favorite wine, so we can agree on that.
All right. Okay, so I guess it's my turn to answer a question, which is would I compare? I gave an example of the Burgundian equivalent of your Chardonnay, and the question is sort of the Cab blend and what might be a right bank of Bordeaux. I mean, I usually try not to compare American wines with French wines, because that usually implies a subservient relationship, and I just don't ever think of things that way. That's one world, and this is another world. It's sort of like thinking about music or art or food. You don't judge a French chef by how they make an Italian dish, and vice versa. But obviously, these wines have an aromaticness and a structure that if it's Bordeaux, it might be something more akin to, like, say, Saint Estèphe maybe. But I don't really. I think the beauty of wine is really in appreciating each thing for what it is. It might be that wine, but it might also be that vintage, and I know how I felt when I tasted your 2017s, which I wrote about. And the perception of that vintage is not a factor at all. It's sort of appreciation for each of its things. So, we have a ton of questions. I wish we could get to them all. We can't, but I just want to thank you so much for your just being available. A couple people have asked how to get in touch with you, so I suppose there's probably an email address on your website that people can write to. And
they almost all go to the same place. So write any of those or direct message us on Instagram, any of these platforms. Yeah. We'd be happy to hear from people. And I will say, Cameron, our younger sister, escaped this time. So next time we're going to drag her into the frame.
We'll look forward to that. A new victim for questions.
That's right.
I just want to thank everybody for tuning in on Friday. You obviously have an enormous number of fans, so congratulations. Thanks everybody for watching. Cheers and have a good weekend. See you soon.
Happy weekend.
Thanks, Antonio.
Bye.
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 Thanks, guys.